and the contraceptive vaccine success that we've had recently has prompted somebody to invite me to talk to you guys. And then I changed the subject and I said, yeah, but I don't want to talk about the contraceptive vaccine. I want to talk about this computational modeling thing that I'm working on. So since I just said I'm a biochemist, I have to tell you why the hell I'm working on population. And it was a natural progression because as a biochemist and a bioinformaticist, as a programmer, I've been working on developing models for a number of years. And this goes back 20 years. I worked on hidden Markov models to look at the correlation between protein sequence and protein structure. And after I got to Rensselaer and met a guy named Carl McDaniel, we started working on Markov chain food web, and I got interested in global ecology. And turns out hidden Markov models and Markov chain food web have a lot of the programming elements in common. So it felt like it came naturally to me to do this kind of modeling. And Carl had the brilliant idea of looking at adaptation over time and how human culture will affect the ecosystem if you assume certain things about how humans adapt. And basically that we adapt much, much faster than other species. All of us species adapt. So you see humans taking over the planet at the end of this simulation. Um, so because of this influence now by Carl McDaniel, check out his books if you get a chance. I started teaching a course called Human Population, and with my students in the course, we developed models inspired by Dana Meadows and Dennis Meadows, the world models. And it's gone through several generations. World 1, did I skip over World 1? Yeah, was a country-based model with closed systems. And you can see this, what I'm showing you here is like a Markov model, but each of the squares in there are quantities, and each of the circles are kind of variables, and each of the arrows are flows between the squares or the rectangles. So that to me is, oh, it's just a Markov chain. It's just things going from one state to a different state. And I was really ambitious, and we thought, oh, let's try and model the whole global flow of everything, including carbon and metals, and carbon in two different states, CO2 and food. Uh, and our first model was just too complex to the point where at least one student just dropped the course because it was too complex. So we went to version 2, much, much simpler, started using economic inputs such as the Human Development Index, HDI, affluence, life expectancy at birth, and just brainstormed how these things should be connected to each other. And that produced a model that produced oscillations in population. And so that the next year, I taught it again, and we had well, I didn't zoom in on it here. We made it much simpler, and you can see in the lower left corner a model that has just 4 quantities: nature, humans, disease, and technology. And that was able to reproduce 20th century population growth. And then the year after that, we went through a system which led to complete collapse and quickly abandoned that one. That was World 4.4, and then went on to the current model that I'm going to talk about. So it's been, I wanted you to know that I didn't just jump from biochemistry to global population modeling. It was a progression. So anyhow, um,
The Zoom is good.
okay. I'm not the first by a long shot to apply these type of models to population. And of course, the most well-known are the World 1, 2, and 3. World 1 and World 3 were developed by Dana Meadows, Dennis Meadows, Jürgen Randers. And they were rather complex, but it was a playground for human ecologists to work out what would happen if you made certain changes in the rules of the economy or you made different assumptions about the ecosystem, and then you could lay it out. And in the book, Limits to Growth, the 30-year update, 2004, which is the book we use for the course, at the front of the book, they have the population trajectory in yellow and the resources trajectory in red. And so, although people looking at the book may not realize it, that's really a doomsday model here. There's population and there's carrying capacity. Um, I worked with this, and this has been updated recently by Gaia Harrington in December last year. Published a paper updating World 3, and I'm trying to get a hold of her to see if we could just share ideas about modeling and look at the why our results are actually pretty similar. But I wanted to share and see if there are any differences there or if we made different assumptions. So that's World 3, and I still teach World 3. We're gonna move on to World 4 though, and so because World 3 is like a playground, but it's not so much. It doesn't allow you very easily to make um, predictions. You can make predictions, I'm sorry, but it doesn't allow you to fit to existing population data. And so I wanted to be able to do that. Now, Gaia Harrington has found a solution for that, and she does fit to existing data, and I say more power to her. But what I did is simplify it. So to start off, we look at 20th century growth, and it's hyper exponential. Is this really exponential? No, it's not exponential. If you put it into Excel and you try and fit it to the exponential growth equation, it doesn't fit. What you're looking at there in that salmon color line is the population data back to 2,000 years ago, and it's plotted on the y-axis in log scale. And if it really were exponential, then when you plot it in log scale, it would be a nice straight line. And that's what it is for most animals. Most animals just grow exponentially because the rate of growth is proportional to how many you have. But we're not seeing that for humans. In fact, it's hyper exponential. It fits a growth equation of e to the x, which is super, super fast. So hyper exponential, this became, I explored other equations, but hyper exponential is the one that made physical sense. So then became to look for what could have caused this. Before I get into that, there's another equation that fits the data in the 20th century quite well, and was published in 1960, the year I was born. And and this was by von Forster, and the name of the paper down on the right is Doomsday, Friday the 13th, November AD 2026. And the title refers to the date at which population reaches infinity, because the model for population is a hyperbola, and Friday the 13th, 2026 was the November 2026, happened to be the author's birthday and also the day at which the hyperbola reaches the asymptote. So, so why do I even mention it? It sounds like a joke. Well, if you take this hyperbola model and now you look at the data since 1960, it fits quite well up to about 1999. Von Forster, in order to linearize a hyperbola, he plotted it on log scale. And so it becomes a line. And then time goes from right to left. And so I zoomed in on the part that's after 1960 and showed that it actually goes up for another 40 years along the hyperbola. But then it deviates very strongly from the hyperbola. In 2011, population reached 7 billion. If it had gone on as a hyperbola, we would have been up at like 20 billion. So what does it say? It says the hyperbola maybe was a joke. I mean, he was tongue-in-cheek throughout the paper, but maybe he put it up there as a joke. But there's something about it, and it's its simplicity. that makes it predictive. So I aimed for a very simple model. Um, the character of a of hyper exponential growth can be described easily. Think about a fire in an enclosed space. Um, Fire grows in proportion to itself, which by itself would make fire grow exponentially. But firefighters will tell you that if you have a fire in an enclosed space, it grows much faster, grows explosively, and that's because the fire heats up the fuel, and so its rate of growth actually goes up. And if its rate of growth grows with the size of the fire, then well, let's see, if its rate of growth is its intrinsic exponential rate goes with the size of the fire, then it follows that e to the x equation, and you get explosive growth. The other way that a fire in a closed space may be relevant to human population growth is that the enclosed space provides a hard limit. We're going to assume the fire can't escape the space and that there's no additional oxygen. Well, then it's going to turn around at some point because it's going to run out of fuel and oxygen. So this is, I think, a simple conceptual model for how we can model human population, and I don't mean this to be hyperbolic or it does go to zero. That doesn't matter. It's a conceptual model. It's a mind model for building something. It doesn't mean that now my model is going to go to zero. Um, if you have this equation where the exponent in the equation is itself growing exponentially, what that does is it implies that there are two growing quantities. There's the one expressed by the whole equation e to the e to the x, and there's a quantity expressed by just the exponent part, the e to the x part. So it means two things are growing. So, and that's important because that means that we have to model not just population, but something else. Well, what's the something else? Well, it wouldn't take you guys too long to figure out. It's probably something like technology, something owned by humanity, and yet something that grows intrinsically. It seems to, it's hard to put a number on technology, but we're going to call this thing, this abstract quantity, technology, and we're going to say that it grows intrinsically, and that the population now grows intrinsically. Technology grows intrinsically, and technology being the rate of the growth of population, it means that the rate of growth is proportional to technology. And so and then that means that the population grows in proportion to population plus technology. So there's two components to the rate of growth. There's the intrinsic component, we're growing in proportion to ourselves, and also and added to that in the exponent is an add-on component called technology. So and I'm glibly saying this, but you know that what I'm saying is like a catchword. It's a placeholder for something which is not yet described. It's a word now that fits what we think about when we think of technology. We think of technology as making things more efficient, producing more food, producing medicine, basically things that allow us to live longer and consume more. So, but right now it's just kind of the placeholder for building something into the model. And I'm not going to worry about what it actually means. But other people have worried about what it means, and there's if you look, lots of spilled ink in the literature about the growth of technology, and even in the literature about the singularity, the idea that technology gets to a point where it's out of control. And I'm not going to talk about the singularity, even though it's in my title and it's discussed in the paper. It gets into a little too woohoo for me. The other aspect of the model is the Earth itself, which provides the limits to growth. So in the fire in an enclosed space model, the Earth is the enclosed space. The Earth can't change size. More importantly, it can't change energy input. So Mathis Wackernagel, who is the proponent and the inventor, I guess, of the ecological footprint concept, um, sort of set the stage for this for me in his book. This is first author is David Lynn. Uh, he proposed a view where the whole Earth consists of human sphere and ecosphere, and the human sphere are the domesticated parts of the planet and domesticated systems within the planet, so includes land and ocean and the atmosphere. And the ecosphere part is the non-domesticated, so it sums to a constant. Um, and the all biocapacity on the planet sums to a constant. Okay, biocapacity, that's the term used for the productive power of the planet, biocapacity. And ecological footprint is the term used for the consumption of that productive power. So when you consumed all the biocapacity of the planet, you reach the ceiling. This can't go any higher than that. And I'm going to say somewhere below the biocapacity of the planet is the carrying capacity for humans. Um, so biocapacity is split between human sphere and ecosphere. And ecosphere, I'm just going to assert for now, is determinant of the carrying capacity for humans, which is something that is cannot be greater than the biocapacity for the planet. And that the carrying capacity is defined as something that cannot be exceeded. Um, so why is that? Okay, so this goes back to basic ecology, that there are two types of species out there. The R-selected species that are just constantly reproducing at their maximum level, and the K-selected species that are reproducing at a level limited by the environment. They were limited by the carrying capacity. So they grow up to the carrying capacity and they stop. So this is a simplifying assumption in ecology, but still widely respected and used and believed, and holds a lot of truth, that we really, species really do fall into these two classes of reproductive strategy. So we're K-selected. Yes. This is something hard to swallow for some people based on the responses to publications that insist that we are case selected. But we are case selected, therefore our population is controlled by carrying capacity, not really by anything that we attempt to do. We don't really control our population. It's controlled by the carrying capacity. So those two systems now compose the model that I'm talking about. It's called World4. I asked Dennis Meadows if I could use that term, and he says, why not? So World4 is what it's going to be called. And it consists of the two shaded areas there in the upper left are closed systems. So those are, and the rectangles are quantities, and the arrows are flows between the quantities. The quantities in systems dynamics are called stocks. So these are flows between stocks. So the first and the second one, we have the environment, which are, or the Earth, and that's composed of ecosphere and human sphere, following the worldview of Mathis Wackernagel and the footprint literature. And the flow from human sphere to ecosphere is called rewilding. I arbitrarily gave them names. To think about it, the flow from human sphere to ecosphere could also be called death, because that's what it is. It's the release of your consumption back to the wild. And domestication of the ecosphere could also be called birth, because every time someone's born, they are now getting allocated more of the planet's resources. But I called them rewilding and domestication because the units here are not people. The units are land. The units are formally are global hectares, which is the footprint unit. So it's not even land. But so that global hectares number, the total in that orangish shaded environment, there's a total amount in that, and that has been um, measured. I was going to say predicted, but I think it's more like measured by the footprint community, Mathis Wackernickel, and that's the number I started with. Turns the sneak peek is that I found out that I think his number is a little too high, but there's a finite number for that. Now move up to the purplish zone there. It says ignorance and knowledge, and I really struggled with the terminology here, but I just decided technology is about knowledge. Knowledge is something that grows intrinsically, and to make it a closed system, it has to come from something, so it comes from ignorance. And the way that that number is applied to humanity is as a death rate. So the rewilding flow is proportional to the rate of that rewilding or death is proportional to how much we don't know, which is the ignorance quantity. So there's units for everything, and the units for ignorance are the rate of mortality. Um, and so knowledge here, I mean, when you do a formal system dynamics model, you have to put units on everything. So what are the units of knowledge? Well, for this model, the units of knowledge are the rate of not dying. Let's say the rate the units for ignorance are the rate of dying, and then the units for knowledge are how much that we are surviving instead of dying. So I hope that works for you. So that's what it is. And so the other parts of this model are the outputs, and in the white circle oval at the bottom, there's outputs. There, CC stands for carrying capacity. That depends on knowledge because it depends on our ability to produce food. CC depends on the ecosphere because the ecosphere recycles and cleans up our waste.
So, Chris,
Yeah,
Chris,
Luis.
so just to make sure, the units of technology then is humans, people.
Formally, the units of ignorance and knowledge are reciprocal years.
Oh,
Years to the -1. That's the units. So
okay,
that reciprocal time are rate. The reciprocal time is a measure of rate. So if I multiply ignorance reciprocal years times human sphere, that becomes, my pointer. If I multiply ignorance reciprocal years times human sphere, I get rewilding.
okay,
So
okay,
but you should just think of it as this is the mortality. Ignorance is mortality. I want a bumper sticker that says ignorance is mortality. And so that's what I'm modeling. And then human sphere is proportional to population, and we lose human sphere if we're more ignorant. Okay. So anyhow, that's it. It's simple, but it leads to some complex behavior. I was talking about this. Carrying capacity is proportional, is dependent upon, not proportional, but dependent upon the ecosphere, because the amount of ecosphere determines the degree to which we can grow things, the degree to which the environment absorbs our waste, and that's about it. It's dependent on knowledge because the amount of food we can grow for humans depends on the technology, and it depends on human sphere because of why? I'm blanking on that. Why does it depend on human sphere? It shouldn't. I don't know. I think it's because it's a fraction or something. I'll look it up.
Well, I would say that human sphere the bigger human sphere is, the lower carrying capacity becomes.
Yeah, I'll have to. I'm going to bring up the model later, and then we can play with it. But
Mhm.
but anyhow, these dotted lines are just dependencies, and population is just derived from carrying capacity, and that's in the spirit of the assumption that I mentioned earlier. Humans are a case-selected species, and we are always at the carrying capacity. I realize this is a different definition for carrying capacity, but uh, it is. I think it's still in the same spirit as other people's carrying capacities are differing in definition. Some people think it's a fixed number. Some people think it's a dynamic number, and some people think it's not really a limit because you can actually go above it. And I thought about this a lot, and I thought, well, you got to nail it down and have one definition. So I made it that the carrying capacity is a number that you cannot exceed, and it's the value that the population of a case-selected population goes to. Anyway, so you have to, and arguing about what carrying capacity is semantic, and I just don't want to have semantic arguments. So I just say, okay, I'll rename it if you like, but I'm calling carrying capacity something that you cannot go above. Um, then all these things are the buttons and knobs for controlling the model. Some of them are not fittable parameters. And the other ones are fittable parameters, which means we can fit the output to the true population data. The orange ones were variables that were fit to the years 1000 to 1970. 1970 is important because that's the nearest census year to the year hyper-exponential growth stopped. So I cordon that off, and I will fit the variables that affect population up to 1970 to the orange uh, variables here. Each one has a story. There's a total amount of maximum knowledge there. There's the size of the human sphere, the size of the ecosphere. There's the growth rate, the intrinsic growth rate of knowledge, the intrinsic birth rate, the intrinsic growth rate of the human sphere is there. And then there's the parameters for the footprint, A, B, and C are parameters of a function that translates ecosphere into carrying capacity. And two of them are insensitive to recent years, and one of them is sensitive to recent years. And this is the one I'll talk about. This fragility number, variable A, determines the future a lot. And then there's also controls of the feedback mechanisms, and that's the feedback of ecosphere to obsolescence is the key feedback here. What happens to technology as we destroy the ecosphere? What's going to happen there? So those are unknowns, but you have to model them in and allow the modeler to tweak those knobs. So these are the feedback controls. Knowledge, how it feeds on carrying capacity, that's this dotted line. Uh, Ecosphere, how it affects domestication, that's no, I'm sorry, it's not in here. Ecosphere to domestication, it's directly connected. And ecosphere to obsolescence. And this is the interesting one because that's how depletion of wildlands leads to the obsolescence of technology. And that's key. That's where the singularity comes in. At some point, knowledge turns around, goes backwards. It that's a conclusion I've come to because I think what happens is uh, as the ecosphere disappears, the challenges to survival go up at a higher and higher rate. So the technology that we currently have is no longer good enough. And as an example, I'd say that uh, aquifer technology, when aquifers are depleted, is useless. Kind of like buggy whip technology, when you no longer have horses, is useless. And aquifer technology, this is center pivot well technology that if you fly over the United States, you see all these big circular farms. Those are all aquifer irrigated farms. Aquifers are finite. We discovered in the last few decades they don't really get regenerated by groundwater at an appreciable rate. So that they're going to go to zero, and then what good is that technology? So that rhetorical question is modeled here in obsolescence, as those pumps that pull the water out of the aquifer are now useless. So that means that as you're depleting all the earth, you're going to have increasing numbers of these cases of obsolescence. And as obsolescence goes up, ignorance goes up. As ignorance goes up, rewilding goes up. That is, mortality goes up, and human sphere gets converted back to ecosphere. And that's what you see in the simulations here. So what are these simulations? So this is kind of the sum story of World4 here on this right half of the slide. This is the year, and we are here. And so here, my cursor is right where we are. We don't know exactly the population of 2020 because the census results are not out yet. We do know from the released censuses of the United States and China that the population in 2020 is going to be much lower than what it was projected to be by the United Nations group led by Wolfgang Lutz. So,
Excuse me, does anybody else have a problem seeing your cursor? Because I don't see it. I haven't seen it all talk.
oh, I'm sorry.
I can't hear anybody else.
You know what? The problem is I'm not using the host. I'll use the host.
We can see it now.
Can you see this cursor?
Now I can see it, yeah.
I'm sorry. I was using the wrong cursor.
Okay.
Okay, here, now I'm facing this way. And where I was pointing to is right here, because that's 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And as you can see, there's kind of in the simulations, a wide spread of what the population should be in 2020. I get lots of weird squinty eyes when I point to this because people always say, isn't the population 7.8 billion? And I say, well, how do you know? All we know is that back in 2010, it was 6.9 billion. We don't know what it is in 2020 until the numbers come in. So what everybody is pointing to when they say 7.8 billion is the numbers from Wolfgang Lutz and the United Nations population model, which has us going up to 10 billion or something like that.
Doesn't the CIA have the same number and a few other sources?
CIA sources from the same, CIA World Facts is sourced from the same data. So basically you have a single source for this data, and it's this guy it's not him, it's not one guy, it's economists, basically, demographers. Now, don't make me rant, but if I had to rant, it would be, what the hell are economists doing in the field of ecology, and why do they think that growth has no limits? But never mind. You've heard this, you've probably said it. So I won't go there. I'll just say it, that's when people think about what the population is now, they're talking about a 10 or 11 year projection based on the UN model. That's like not even in the confidence limits of my model. So anyhow, these are simulations. I have an echo there.
So when you say we'll get the numbers when the census will be in, I would think that's the U.S. census for the U.S. population. But what about world population? There's not a census for the entire world population, right? So how will we know if it's 7.5 or 8 billion or 7.8 or 9?
Well, pretty much for the last, I think the last 50 years, we've had global numbers because every country has engaged in these every 10-year census. They're not exactly every 10 years. India's census is in this year, 2021. but most of the countries in the world are participating in the census. And if they're not efficiently getting a survey out to everybody, they're at least doing their own modeling based on their own vital statistics. So these data are quite good. I mean, the estimates are that the errors in global population are in the range of 3%. So this is why I'm really anchoring the model on this data, is that it's pretty good. But of course, it is not out yet for 2020. So, but what's come out so far is that it's going to be lower than expected, both in China and.
When should we know what it was actually in 2020 world population?
What? Say it again.
When should we know it, like for sure? Because
when do we?
Yeah, I'll be surprised if I see a revision from 7 point up. To be honest with you, from 7.8 or 9 to 7.5. But when will we know it? Like, when will everybody have fairly completed their?
I think next year, probably early next year, because if the census in India matters a lot, and that's ongoing this year. So yeah, I analyzed the U.S. census number, and I used I put in a factor assuming that the fraction of the population of the world of the U.S. is not changing. That is, if all other countries as an aggregate follow the lead of the U.S. population, then we're at peak, because that's what. So we're now, at the peak population. So we'll see. And in fact, now news is coming out that the population may have fallen in the last year. So we're right there, I think. So I'd love to get the actual facts, but it was I think it was strategically good for me to publish this before the facts are out, because then when the facts come out, that I can't be accused of using those data to make this model. So and so if it turns out that the current population is in the range of 7.1 billion, that means that it went up and came back down in the last 10 years, and that would have been a shocker. But if I already had the data and then I went ahead and predicted it, that would be like I would not even get it published. You're just predicting what we already know. So I was fortuitous, I guess, that this was before the census numbers came out. But let me say something about what is this whole spread here, because this is the deep dive part. Why do we have this wide range of uncertainty here? First of all, the way the model works is that you give it these parameters here, these 16 numbers, and then it's run in a deterministic way. There are no random numbers. And so if you run it with the same parameters, you always get the same result. And then what I did was randomized these numbers. So especially the yellow ones here. And then I selected and I ran millions of cycles, millions of simulations. And I selected the ones that matched the 20th century data, the known data. So this was very unbiased in that sense. It's biased in the sense that the model is designed by me, but then the parameters are selected by random chance, and I had to do a million or so simulations to find it's about 100 simulations that fit the 20th century data. So you can see, and all of them are plotted there. So you can see they line up from 1970, or let's see, 2010 back. They line up perfectly. They match the data pretty much, and then they widely diverge, because there's some parameters that will are saying that we're on the verge of collapse, and other settings which are saying that we're just going to plateau out. So the most important of these is the E0, E0 is the amount of ecosphere. So although the other parameters also matter, the E0 number, the total estimate, this is the Mathis-Wackernagle number. This is the footprint number. This number really determines whether we collapse dramatically or we have a much shallow, we kind of plateau out. So I looked at that and it was counterintuitive. Intuitive would be if E0 is higher, that means there's more wild nature, that we should plateau out. But it turned out in the simulation the opposite. So higher numbers are down here, they're in purple. And so these blue and purple, these are the highest numbers for the setting of total wild planet. And the higher numbers mean that we're going to collapse. So I had to look at that. And then lower numbers, here's lower numbers, means that we're going to plateau out, right? So I had to look at that and try to explain why it is that if we have more resources, we in fact are going to have a lower future carrying capacity, right? And what I saw was that it's how it plays, it's how this variable interacts with other variables. If indeed, let's just take the example of this extreme purple one, that this is the very high, this is the closest to Mathis-Wagernagle's estimate. This very high value for E0 should mean that we can go much higher. So what happens is that if you ignore all the other parameters, then you're going to get hyper-exponential growth for longer with a higher value of E0. So it's going to be hyper-exponential growth. What does that mean? It means that this population is going to curve up. So then what that means is that, but in fact, since it did not curve up, and we're not allowed to change that one, we just set that value, then we have to set other variables in order to make it fit the data. And the main other variables are the fragility of the environment and the ecosphere obsolescence feedback. So let's look at like the fragility of the environment. The fragility of the environment is at what point does the decrease in the ecosphere lead to decrease in the capacity, the carrying capacity? How much, how fragile is it? And I use the analogy of Paul Ehrlich's rivet popper in the Population Explosion book, where, how many rivets do you have to pop out of an airplane before it falls apart? So that's this number A. At some, it's either very robust or it's very fragile. Turns out in order to make the data fit the model fit the data, if the EO is high, we're going to have a very fragile ecosystem. That's in other words, that would explain not having an even steeper population growth in the late 20th century. So to fit the model, then you would have to assume that in fact the ecosystem is very fragile. And now it becomes a job for ecologists to see if that makes sense on the ground. Does it really? It seems like it does. It seems like there's a lot of ways in which the ecosystem is just breaking. So it may be that Mathis-Wackernagle's right. The E0 is quite high, and the ecosystem is very fragile, and we're going to take this purple course here. Now, but if Mathis is way wrong, and the total ecosystem biocapacity is about half of that, then we're just on a smooth curve to about 7.5 billion in the future. We're on the other extreme. And the same thing happens if you, in the fitting, the interaction between biocapacity and the fragility of the ecosystem is, there's a play back and forth of that. So if the carrying, that is, if the total biocapacity is this low and we still have been able to grow at this rate, it must be that the global ecosphere is very robust and it's very forgiving of our insults to it, and we're going to do just fine. So there's those two extremes. That's and the most likely scenario is something in between. So if somebody asks me what's the most likely business as usual, is that we're going to collapse between now, well, let's see, 5 years from now or so, and about wherever that is, if you can see my cursor, 2050. So about 2050, the collapse will end. So you have 25 years of uh, a downturn, which is the steepness of which is a little bit more than the growth rate in the 20th century. So I don't say that that's going to be, catastrophic. I think that if that's catastrophic, well, why wasn't this? I think growth and decline are both measures of change, and so it's going to be a little bit more change than what we saw in the 20th century. But if somebody asks me, what's the most likely, I just pick something in the middle. I think we're going to peak around, 2026. I'll pick the number that Von Forster used. And then we're going to level off at something around 3 billion, or maybe, yeah, 2.5 to 3 billion or so. So I've talked about why it turns around. That's the prior and enclosed space model. I've talked about the spread here being mostly dependent on something we have no control over, just how much biocapacity of the wild there is out there, and the fragility of that wild. And so what else? Anyhow, I should probably move on to the next slide. I spent a long time on that one slide.
So if I may quickly, the steepness being proportional to the amount of biocapacity, I was thinking, let's say we get an abundant source of energy, or we find more oil, then we deplete the aquifers even faster, right?
Okay, so if we had abundant energy, we would make the collapse even faster. Is that what you're saying, Philippe? Yes, that's exactly what I'd predict. If we if we had more abundant water, if we were able to do that, because what we're not doing is saving the wild. We're not able to, unless we can do that too. I mean, if you start going there, can we completely what is it called? Domesticate all wild ecosystem services? I would argue no, we can't. I really don't think we can. I have a slide on that.
So the more water, the more oil we get, the more we deplete the wild faster.
The more, say it again.
The more water or energy or whatever we have at our disposal, the more we'll deplete the wild faster and more.
That's
And
that's not exactly. That's not the conclusion from what I saw, but it was the more, well, I don't know about energy, but the more resources that we have at our disposal, the more likely we will have a steeper collapse. And that's because it reveals something about the fragility of the global ecosphere. And there's no free will here. It's just that we're revealing the way that the Earth really is, and that it's probably more fragile than we thought. Now, so you're saying the more energy we have, the faster we'll collapse. Yes, but it's because we're not putting the limits on ourselves. We're I don't know.
The more energy we have at our disposal, that energy will be used and we used to eat up the ecosphere, right? We wouldn't restrain ourselves from using it.
Okay, the must be your microphone, because I missed the first few words there. So are you saying the less energy we have, the more we have to eat up, or or
The more resources in general,
yeah,
energy or etc. will make we won't restrain ourselves. We will use it, and it will eat up the biodiversity, etc. And prompting a faster and steeper collapse. That's
yeah,
where I understand it.
yeah. Although I would say we don't really have much of a choice, though. I'm of the class of kind of a deterministic person. I don't think, as you can see, the fourth assumption on the slide says humans have no free will, and so you can argue with that, but so I'm more interested in what will happen rather than what if scenarios. But people really want to hear what if scenarios. So what if scenarios? So I have a slide on some what if scenarios. If you don't mind, this is see, we're now up to 12 o'clock. How long would you guys like to go? I don't have that much left, and I have bonus slides on the contraceptive vaccine. Everybody okay?
Sure.
Yeah, I've got about until 12:15.
All right, I'll try and finish up then. I might be able to skip this part. These are the simplifying assumptions. One stock for humans is a simplifying assumption, and that goes against other models where they divide humans up by region or they divide them up by age. Decided not to do that for the sake of simplicity, and there's my arguments for doing that are that migration provides an equalizing uh, mechanism by which we are all effectively in the same pool. And age is simply age demographics uh, is just the change in the rate of the life cycle, and so it doesn't. It's over complexifying. Age demographics is a derivative of the growth rate, not the other way around. So you don't need it in order to model the growth rate. So they're one stock. The other assumption is population cannot exceed the carrying capacity, and to justify this, I say stored food can allow population to temporarily exceed food production, but it doesn't change the outcome much. No one survives for long without food or water. So we can't exceed the carrying capacity enough to make a difference. And there's a paper by Hoffenberg and Pimentel that makes the case for this. So carrying capacity is proportional to wilderness. So I was saying that that hard limit, the carrying capacity, is proportional to the ability of the wild to absorb wastes and recycle carbon. And here's the case for it. Nature provides ecosystem services that we need to survive, including climate stability. That's number one. Protection from UV radiation. If we have more UV radiation, a lot of animals, especially ones that have no fur, are going to die. The absorption of waste and pollution. Oxygen generation is very important, and CO2 fixation, which of course factors into climate stability. All ecosystem services depend on quantity and quality of the ecosystem, which includes the biodiversity and the biocapacity of that ecosystem. So that's I take as a given. Ecosystem services are self-regenerating and proportional to size and system health. So they generate themselves, and humans by definition do not take these responsibilities. So ecosystem services are by definition services given not by humans and not appropriated by humans. Uh, unless you think you could survive without oxygen, I don't think we can assume that we have to assume that ecosystem services are limiting on the population. And to get to the point of, can we domesticate all of these ecosystem services? Well, we tried back in the 90s. They built Biosphere 2, and that was a completely enclosed system. and 8 humans lived inside it, but they could only keep it going for 2 years. So if you can't have a closed system for 2 years that will that's that a small one that holds 8 people, you're not going to make one that's the size of the Earth that will last indefinitely. So I'd say we don't have the ability to replace ecosystem services with human services. And lastly, that humans have no free will is just this is now where I'm pointing to Hoppenberg and Pimentel, that human history has tracked food population over human history has tracked food availability since time immemorial. And so plus the business as usual model is usually the right one. So allowing for free will also allows us to deny the model. That's probably my main reason for playing down free will. The idea hope is kind of like a drug, that if you put hope into the equation, then you're able to deny the business as usual result. And so there's the mind game there, and I don't want to play. Anyhow, so that I can kind of finish up. This is the reason for the peak is explained in a subsegment of the model where you have reciprocal feedback. This creates what's called a Lotka-Volterra cycling, which looks like this. But because the two quantities that are cycling are both growing exponentially, we get a single peak instead of this is called damped Lotka-Volterra in ecology. This is so if both are being depleted at exponential rates, then you get a single cycle. And this is what the cycle looks like if you look at ignorance, which is the mortality rate, and ecosphere. Ecosphere goes down, and ignorance goes down, which is the growth of technology. At some point, the loss of ecosphere makes technology obsolete, and technology goes down, ignorance goes up. As ignorance goes up, the death rate goes up. As the death rate goes up, ecosphere increases and it bounces back, but it doesn't bounce back all the way to where it was because a large fraction of this biocapacity loss is non-renewable. So this is all the non-renewables in there. So the fitting, this is if you're a math head. It was a multi-dimensional least squares fit. And so I plotted this is parameter space. So this is the parameter V, E0 and A plotted in two-dimensional projections, and you can see that the purple is the space in parameter space, the zones in parameter space that allow a fit to 20th century populations that fit this blue line here. And if you're outside that zone, it goes too high or it goes too low. And going along with that fit is the curvature in the future. And so the line that fits it best creates a curvature which peaks out at around today plus or minus 5 years. So it might have actually peaked already. I tend to think it's going to be peaking sometime in the next 10 years. Can a simple model predict the future of human population? I would say only a simple model can. Complex models are hard. Introducing hope into the equation is helpful because people want hope. And so what I did is I added 4 variables for saving wild lands, following the work of E.O. Wilson, who most recent book is called Half Earth. And so he prescribed as a mechanism for saving the planet, reserving half of the Earth for the wild. So let's say we did that. I could do that in the model, and I could say, what happens if with 50% effort and a 20-year phase-in, we save 20, 30, 40, or 50% of the wild land. Then you get this wiggle and then it plateaus out at 7 billion or so. Or if it's 50% wild, if it's 40%, it plateaus out at 6 billion. If it's 30%, it still goes down, but it goes down more slowly. If you do the same policy, but with a with lower enforcement or a longer phase in, it will not stay that high, but it would still raise the lower, like the final population. And so this kind of justifies E.O. Wilson's title of his book, that it takes about half of the planet to save about half the planet to get to keep the population that we have right now. And in the model, the mechanism for that is birth control. Specifically, enforcement. That number I said is that it's the idea that you can't have a baby unless somebody dies. So it's the enforcement of that the birth rate equals the death rate, which in theory you could enforce by some kind of, I don't know, a token that every human has that counts for their life, and you're only allowed to have a baby if you have one of those tokens. You'd have there's some way of matching births to deaths, and so that was used in the model to as a policy to invoke the saving of the wildlands. So anyhow, that's a hopeful scenario. I don't believe, but and then on the grim side, if you look at life expectancy at birth, calculated from not the UN model, which is plotted here, but my model, it's going to go. I had to move the y-axis so that it went down to 0. There's going to be a point at which life expectancy at birth is very low, somewhere around 2050. So if that's a measure of quality of life, then I don't know. Doesn't look good. So this has justified my work on a contraceptive vaccine. And we don't have time, but I could tell you just the highlights of it. I'm still a biochemist, and we looked at the current set of contraceptives out there and tried to explain why we're still seeing such a large number of unwanted pregnancies. And it's because I think the paradigm for contraception is wrong. I love this. This is an answer that Martha Campbell, a UC Berkeley sociologist, to an economist, saying that family planning is just like planning your investments or planning a major appliance purchase. And so Martha Campbell said, "Oh, family planning is like planning to buy a refrigerator? Really? No, It's like having to call the appliance retailer several times a week and say, do not send a refrigerator, or they will go ahead and send one." So, so the answer to that is to turn it around and have the off switch by default, and so have contraception always on, and then just have a way of reversing that. And so that's what we're working on in my lab. We're developing a sperm vaccine, a vaccine that raises immunity against a particular protein on sperm that is important for its ability to fertilize the egg. And the way that we make that into a vaccine is we piggyback on a current vaccine out there called Gardasil. And Gardasil is a virus-like particle. It's not a virus, but it is virus-like. And we piggyback on that, inject that into females or males, and the immunity will block the motility of the sperm. And that can be reversed by blocking the blocker. So we have a blocker, and that is the blocker are the antibodies, and we have a way to block the antibodies that reverses it and temporarily allows conception to go forward. And so that's what we're working on. Here's pictures of wiggling sperm. Here's that Guttmacher data that says about half of pregnancies are either unintended, unwanted, or missed time. and that's been consistent over the last 40 years. That number hasn't gone down. And here's a people in my lab. So, any more questions? I know it's running up against time. People have to leave, so I kind of accelerated toward the end. But
Rob has to leave, but if others have questions, we can go on for another 10 minutes.
absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Well, as I'm uh, have the
Thanks, Chris.
time limit,
Thank you.
I would say thanks, Chris. This has raised all kinds of interesting questions. I have, and it leaves in my mind one kind of dilemma, and one question is, what's happened to the second law of thermodynamics in this? And I
Wait, remind me of the second law of thermodynamics.
Dissipative structures.
I remember the laws of thermodynamics are you can't win, you can't break even, and you can't get out of the game. And so you can't get something from nothing. That's the first law. And the second law is that there's no perpetual motion machine.
I think that's entropy,
That's
right?
right. That's the entropy law, sure.
Yeah.
Third law is, yeah.
Anyway, it didn't immediately occur to me how the second law kind of fits into this. The other kind of dilemma that I see is that you've relied on footprint data, and I guess arguably, in my mind anyway, the notion of a footprint is a metaphor. That it's really not a measurable concept. Everything is being reduced to a single entity and land units, and it's an exercise in comparative statics, and so that implies that technology is fixed. And it seems to me that contradicts a little bit your notion of the dynamics of technology.
No, footprint is quantifiable. They're quantifying. They use a common unit for all resources called the global.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, and we've used a common unit to measure GDP, but it's equally as immeasurable. Reducing things to a common unit implies just a whole pile of assumptions, and if you dig, most of them can't be justified.
Well, I think Mathis Wackernagel would differ with you, but I'm not going to be. I can't argue. I do. I do not. My model does not depend on any of the footprint data, even the total number. Everything is derived from fitting is derived from population data. It is not. It's not sitting on top of the footprint data. It's using ecosphere, human sphere, global worldview. Is that, and that's all. And even that, I think, is a little bit modified in my model. So it does not depend on the footprint data.
Well, Bill Reese, who was the instructor for Math's graduate studies, is on our list. So perhaps this particular question could be presented to Bill, and he might be willing to watch the recorded version of this and then give us an answer from his point of view.
Yeah, if so, then you have to state the question clearly. And I'd like to hear Bill Reese's general take on Mathis's data, and how hard is this data? How can we count on those numbers? Are those solid? And I'll leave that for Bill Reese and Mathis Wacker now.
I need to leave now, so thanks very much, Chris, and nice to meet everybody.
Chris, one more question.
Sure.
Take care, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Hello Hello to everybody.
Hi, Luis.
Recently, I have seen some reports that life expectancy here in the US is decreasing. So, based on your presentation, is it reasonable to say that it may really be decreasing because we're consuming too much resources and invading too much wildlife?
Yeah, that's what I'd say. I've seen the data, and this is a CIA fact book, I think. They have all this data that you can peruse, and you're right that the adult mortality data has gone up. It was the lowest in 2016, and now it's going up. And at the same time, the fertility has been going down even more steeply since about, well, in the 2016 timeframe, fertility's been going down even more steeply than it was before. So those vital statistics suggest that we are turning around right now. So I don't know. The causality, I think, is secondary. I mean, first you have data. If data says it's turning around, then it is. And then what's causing it? It's kind of like asking if climate change caused a particular storm.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's hard to answer, but certainly what I would say is that population is governed by the carrying capacity. So if population is going down, that the carrying capacity is going down.
Yeah. I recently saw some data to the effect that GDP per capita here in the US is the largest for the world. So causation is difficult to establish, but it is an interesting correlation.
It is difficult, but people want to hear it too. And so I had to put in some kind of anecdotal data in there just to illustrate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting.
Hey, Chris, real quick, Fred from Michigan here. I'm a retired electrical engineer with a background in cellular system design, not biocellular, but cell towers and communication. So I'm somewhat familiar with Monte Carlo modeling and stuff. But my wife is more into the biology, and she asked regarding your fertility vaccine or anti-fertility vaccine. Do you know of any problems with excretion of the product, and if that would be likely to impact the environment in any way such that it suppresses fertility of animals and aquatic environment, stuff like that?
What she's referring to is hormonal contraception, and that it's going into the wild through wastewater and affecting fish and frogs and other animals that are sensitive to these kind of these hormones. And so my technology is not hormonal and is not excreted. It's an injection. It's a vaccine. And so the answer is no. There's no environmental impact of that, and there's a benefit for many women to not having to take hormones. Hormones are not tolerated by all women.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I see Eric Lee has joined us at some point, but I can't see him and I can't hear him. So anyway, hi, Eric. We'd like to meet you sometime.
Okay, unshared.
Yeah. Well, I see a blank ceiling with a light or something. Anyway, thanks again, Chris. It was really worthwhile. And what would be useful to me would be to have, well, maybe those graphs are all in your paper because I don't remember. So then I can look at the paper and blow them up a little just to refresh my memory. But the talk made it a lot clearer than just me reading the formulas on your paper.
Well,
So thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me. I'll make the recording available. I'll send a link to the group.
Great. Nice to see you, Philippe and Louis and
Hey,
Fred.